one of the main arguments that you'll hear in regards to crime data and firearms the last several years now deals with the correlation between the increasing homicide rate and the increasing number of gun sales in the United States. And the argument is that those two things are not just correlated, but also that one is causing the other, in particular that gun sales increasing led to homicides increasing. You've written about this. I mean, I've written about it as well, but I want to hear a little more from you on what you make of this argument. You know, is there any validity to it? And if not, why not?
Well, the way I put it in a piece I wrote for National Review about a year ago now, is that there's sort of a paradox here, because there are two different ways of drilling into that correlation. One is to look geographically, and you can say, look, we had this huge surge in gun sales, but different states had surges in gun sales to different degrees. Is there a correlation there? Did the places that saw the biggest spikes in homicide also have the biggest spikes in gun sales? And the answer to that question is no. If you plot the data, those numbers against each other, there's just nothing there. There's no geographic correlation there. But another good data source that helps us get at that question is the ATF's gun trace data. Unfortunately, those aren't broken down as finely as we would like them to be, but you can see in those numbers what percentage of guns that were traced by police departments had been purchased recently. And those numbers, in fact, shot up at the same time. So it seems that newer guns are being more likely to be traced by police departments, but it does not appear that the places where the guns are being sold are the places where they're seeing homicide spikes. So I came up with what I think is a sort of a reasonable theory to reconcile those two things, which is that you actually had two different things going on there. One is that you have the pandemic and the riots, and that causes a lot of people to be scared and they run out and buy guns. These are illegal gun purchases. Overwhelmingly, they don't really have anything to do with crime. They're by law-abiding people who are passing background checks. But at the same time, you have this dramatic surge in violence. And when there's a surge in violence like that, you're going to have criminals being more likely to search out guns. And one way they search out guns is by trafficking them. So that there's going to be a surge in newly bought guns that are showing up at crimes, but it isn't necessarily part of the same phenomenon as just sort of this generalized surge in gun buying.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. Sort of explanation for both of those pieces of data, because you're right that the trace data is interesting in that it does show there was some increase in how quickly a gun went from a sale to what the ATF calls time to crime, which is how quickly it went from being sold to being recovered at a crime scene. Although, like you said, there's any breakdown on what kind of crime scene it was. Or why the ATF recovered it, anything like that. So it's not really granular in the way that like the FBI's crime data is supposed to be. But I thought that the sort of an inherent flaw in this. To me, there were 2 points that matter quite a lot, which is that the reason we know that gun sales increased is because the way you track that is through, as you briefly mentioned there, the number of FBI background checks that were conducted through the National Criminal Background Check System. And which means that in order to obtain the gun in the first place, you have to not have a criminal record. Now, obviously, as you pointed out, you can use straw purchasers, basically people who don't have criminal records but are buying guns for people with criminal records, intentionally doing that. You can still have some percentage of those people who pass the background check where their gun ultimately ends up in a crime quickly because of trafficking. But you still have time to crime at, I believe it was 8 years last time I looked. It might be slightly less than that now, but I don't think the time has come down on average very much. The median time to crime is not, has not significantly dropped over these last 2 years, as you would expect if all of the new gun sales were going straight into committing homicides.
Yeah.
So I think there's a number of issues with this concept that because gun sales rose at the same time that homicides rose, that the gun sales must be causing the homicides. And in fact, and I think you've written about this a little bit, it may well be the other way around.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that's one thing. As a gun owner, you know, I'm sure, and I'm sure you've heard it from plenty of other people. One of the biggest reasons people name for buying a gun is that they're looking to defend themselves. And when you have rising crime, when you have rising homicide rates, and you have just generally scary things happening like the pandemics and the riots of 2020, you want to protect yourself. So that's an obvious driver of the gun sale spike. So it's very difficult to sort out statistically, you know, which direction the causation runs sometimes.
Yeah, and I would say too that in 2020, the largest relative increase in monthly gun sales, as judged through NICS checks, was actually in June, not in March. March 2020 had the most gun related background checks in history, and that's obviously when the onset of the pandemic and the lockdowns occurred. But June 2020 had a larger relative increase from a normal June, because June is the summer months. Gun sales are cyclical, so they go. There's a certain cycle. They pick up in the fall. Usually, Black Friday is the largest gun sales day of the year, traditionally, and then there's hunting season starts at that time as well, and then they move through the winter and spring, and they're relatively strong times. And spring's pretty strong because that's the model year end, so there's more bargains generally, and then it tapers off in summer. But in June of 2020, there was a huge spike in sales that was also happened to be around the time that we saw that George Floyd was murdered, and then there were protests, which of course oftentimes ended in rioting that spread across the country. So there seems like a fairly obvious at least correlation. I guess you'd have to do a little more to prove causation, just like the other way around.
Yeah, so sometimes common sense, I think, gets you pretty far, as in that case. Right. Yeah.
Whereas there's a number of common sense reasons to think that the gun sales spike is not the catalyst for the gun murder or the homicide rate spike. Because again, the people who were buying those guns were passing background checks to do it. That's how we know there was a spike. There may have been a spike. There probably was, as you mentioned, a spike in criminal gun sales as well, like the number of illegal sales to people who can't own guns. But that would be something that's not tracked necessarily by the number of NICS checks done.
Right.
Because, that's criminals don't go into gun stores to buy guns because they won't be able to actually pass the background check. But they'll go to, the person that they know who has guns and is willing to sell them to them or give them. I mean, oftentimes gangs will use, it's almost like a gun library. They pass the guns around between each other to whoever needs them at whatever moment. So, and obviously criminal, as you sort of alluded to there, a lot of the criminal motivations for carrying guns are not just to commit criminal acts, robberies or what have you, but oftentimes criminals carry the guns for the same reasons that anyone else would carry them, which is self-defense. They feel that they are in danger and they want to carry guns even if they're not allowed to under law. And so, they'll at times where violence spikes, it wouldn't be a surprising thing to find that criminals tend to arm themselves more often, on a more regular basis at those times, right? Yeah,
I think that's basically the gist of my theory. Is that you have two different things going on. You have people lawfully trying to arm themselves because the world has gotten really scary, and then you also have criminals trying to arm themselves because the world has gotten really scary. And they're two different phenomena to a large extent, because in one case you have people going in and buying the guns and passing background checks, and in the other case you have criminals trying to procure guns kind of however whatever way they can. And sometimes those are going to overlap where the criminals get newer guns because they were able to steal a gun that had just been purchased, or there's a straw purchasing situation, or what have you. But I think that's a way of reconciling these two facts where there doesn't seem to be a geographical link between the gun sales and the homicide spike, but there does seem to be this surge of recently purchased guns being traced by the police.
Yeah, and I would also, I wonder about your. I want to get your thoughts on this. Obviously, during that lull in, the homicide rate in the United States, we used to have very high homicide rates in the 80s and 90s, and they came down in the early 2000s, and they've stayed relatively low up until just recently here. And during that period, especially the Obama administration, right? The gun sales picked up dramatically from 2008 to 2016, especially after the Sandy Hook shooting in 2013, or when people were concerned that there would be new restrictions on gun ownership. There was a huge spike in gun sales, but we didn't see a corresponding spike in the homicide rate at that point. What do you make of that? Like, is that further evidence that there isn't really a causal link between gun sales through the background check system and the homicide rate generally?
I mean, at minimum, I would say it shows that it's very complicated. I think a lot of people who are very fervent gun control activists see it as a sort of one-step solution to our murder problem. But there's just very clearly not a one-to-one relationship between, gun control laws or gun sales and homicide. Over the 1990s, a lot of states were liberalizing their concealed carry laws. That was the biggest drop in homicide I think we've ever seen. Yet there was a continued lull through the 2010s as well, as gun ownership was rising. And
going off of that, actually, you'll see some gun rights advocates argue the opposite direction, right? Like you mentioned there was a liberalization of gun carry laws at the very least in the 90s through the 2000s, and a similar time period that we saw a decrease in the homicide rate. Is that enough evidence to conclude that there's a causal relationship there too, or how do you view these things?
I mean, I would say no. And I'm actually working on a report right now that goes through some of the concealed carry literature. So I've been looking at this pretty closely. But the states that never implemented concealed carry at all saw some of the biggest drops that anybody saw over that period.
And what do you mean? Like, what do you mean by never implemented?
Well, basically what I did for my report is I sorted out states based on when they implemented concealed carry with the states that never implemented it through Brune.
I mean, like May issue states. So like,
yeah,
New York
May issue states. Yeah, so on and so forth.
Okay.
But they saw as big a drops as anybody saw. I don't think there's any clear relationship between implementing concealed carry and seeing especially big drops in homicide. So when you start the data out that way, I think it's more of just sort of a null result. There doesn't seem to be a big effect in either direction.